Every great empire believes it has discovered the secret to eternal prosperity. Every great empire believes that the economic laws which governed its predecessors somehow do not apply to its own exceptional circumstances. Every single one of these empires has been catastrophically wrong. The Romans believed their silver denarius would remain the unshakable foundation of Mediterranean commerce forever. The British believed the largest empire in human history guaranteed sterling's dominance. Today, Americans believe the dollar's status as the world's reserve currency makes the United States immune to the laws of fiscal gravity that have destroyed every great power that came before. History suggests otherwise. Understanding why requires examining the remarkably consistent pattern that has preceded every major currency collapse in recorded history. This pattern is not complicated. It is not hidden. It plays out in plain sight, over decades or even centuries, and yet every generation believes it will be the one to escape the consequences. Let us begin with Rome. At the height of the Pax Romana, the silver denarius was one of the most trusted currencies in the ancient world. A single coin represented roughly a day's wage for a skilled laborer and contained approximately 4.5 grams of pure silver. Its reliability facilitated trade across 3 continents. For nearly 2 centuries, Roman citizens could trust that the coins in their purses would hold their value. Then the bills came due. Maintaining legions across vast frontiers required enormous expenditure. Funding urban welfare programs consumed vast resources. Sustaining a sprawling imperial bureaucracy demanded constant revenue. These fiscal demands created pressures that tax revenues alone could not satisfy. And raising taxes directly was politically dangerous. Emperors who taxed too heavily tended to find themselves on the wrong end of a Praetorian sword. Does any of this sound familiar? A government spending beyond its means on military commitments, social programs, and administrative overhead, unable to raise taxes sufficiently to cover the gap? The Roman solution was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its consequences. Rather than raise taxes or cut spending, they reduced the silver content in each coin while maintaining its face value. They called it reform. We would call it inflation. Emperor Nero began modestly around 64 AD, shaving the silver content by approximately 10%. His successors followed suit. By the reign of Marcus Aurelius, the denarius contained only about 75% silver. Still, the economy functioned. The debasement seemed to be working. Then came Caracalla, who introduced a new coin, supposedly worth 2 denarii, but containing only the silver of 1.5. A debasement disguised as monetary innovation. By the 260s AD under Emperor Gallienus, the supposedly silver denarius contained barely 5% actual silver, essentially a bronze core with a thin silver wash that wore off quickly, revealing worthless metal beneath. The effects were predictable but maddeningly slow to materialize, which is precisely why the policy was so seductive. Initially, prices remained stable. The debasement was gradual enough that most citizens did not connect their diminishing purchasing power to government monetary policy. Merchants adjusted prices slowly. The economy adapted year after year to each small reduction in silver content. Then came the tipping point. By 290 AD, prices for basic goods had increased roughly 70 times compared to 2 centuries earlier. A loaf of bread that cost 1 denarius in the time of Augustus cost 70 denarii under Diocletian. Trade networks dissolved as merchants refused debased currency. Soldiers demanded ever higher wages, creating a vicious cycle of debasement and wage demands. Local economies retreated into barter. Emperor Diocletian attempted price controls with his famous edict on maximum prices, setting maximum legal prices for over 1,000 goods under penalty of death. It failed utterly. Black markets flourished. Merchants hid their goods. You cannot legislate away the consequences of debased currency. Nearly 2 millennia later, the Weimar Republic provided an accelerated demonstration of the identical phenomenon. Germany emerged from World War I with crushing reparations debt and a shattered industrial base. Unable to collect sufficient tax revenue and politically incapable of cutting spending, the government resorted to the printing press. At first, the effects were manageable. Germans adapted, demanding wages be adjusted more frequently, spending money quickly before it lost value. Then, in 1923, the system broke completely. The trigger was the French occupation of the Ruhr in response to missed reparations payments. The German government paid workers to strike rather than produce for the French, printing even more money to pay workers producing nothing. At its peak, prices doubled every few days. A loaf of bread that cost 250 marks in January 1923 cost 200 billion marks by November. The workers were paid twice daily, racing to shops during lunch because morning wages would be worthless by evening. Families burned banknotes for fuel because paper money had less value per pound than firewood. Life savings evaporated in weeks. The German middle class was systematically annihilated. What Rome accomplished over 200 years, Germany compressed into months. But the mechanism was identical. A government that could not balance its books chose to inflate its way out of debt. Transferring wealth from savers to the state through the hidden tax of currency debasement, Rome boiled the frog slowly. Weimar threw it directly into boiling water. Britain's decline offers perhaps the most instructive parallel for modern America. It's precisely because Britain was the previous holder of the world's reserve currency. For over a century, from Napoleon's defeat to World War I, sterling was the dollar of its day. International trade was denominated in pounds. Foreign nations held reserves in sterling. London was the world's financial center. 2 world wars destroyed this system. By 1945, Britain had exhausted its gold reserves, paying for weapons from the United States. It had liquidated overseas investments, selling off the foreign assets that had generated income for generations. It had accumulated massive debts. National debt exceeded 200% of GDP. The once mighty empire was functionally bankrupt. Rather than face genuine austerity or default openly, British policymakers found a third path, one that avoided both dramatic crisis and honest reckoning. Over the following 3 decades, the pound's purchasing power collapsed by over 90%. The currency that had dominated global finance became a second-tier player. The empire wound down and global finance rebalanced as New York rose alongside London. Without hyperinflation or systemic collapse, Britain navigated a gradual transition from global hegemon to a stable, influential mid-sized European economy. How did they manage this controlled demolition? The answer is the key to understanding what America is doing right now. The pattern across all these empires is identical. First, commitments expand beyond what the productive economy can sustain, and rather than cut spending or raise taxes, the government debases the currency. Initially imperceptible, eventually catastrophic. Rome took 2 centuries. Weimar took 2 years. Britain managed controlled decline over 2 generations. America is now running the same playbook. Strategy Britain used to escape its post-war debt is being deployed at unprecedented scale. But most Americans do not even know it is happening. The hidden tax here is how America is quietly erasing its debt, and how Britain escaped its post-war bankruptcy, paying creditors back in dollars worth less than the dollars borrowed. The mechanism is called financial repression. When the government borrows money by issuing treasury bonds, it promises to pay a fixed interest rate. That rate is 4%, but inflation runs at 6%. The bondholder loses 2% of purchasing power annually even while receiving every promised payment. The debt is serviced in full on a nominal basis, with all payments made as scheduled. Over time, inflation reduces its real burden without any formal default, yet wealth transfers silently from savers to the government. This is exactly what Britain did for 30 years after World War II. It is exactly what America is doing now. This is not theory, it is current policy. Since 2020, cumulative inflation has exceeded 30%, while Treasury yields have remained suppressed. Every dollar lent to the government in 2020 now buys roughly 70 cents worth of goods. The Federal Reserve, by keeping rates below the true inflation rate for extended periods, has enabled the largest wealth transfer in American history, not through legislation, not through taxation, but through the quiet erosion of the currency itself. Consider the mathematics at scale. America's debt now exceeds $38 trillion. If inflation averages 5% while government borrowing costs average 4%, America erases roughly 1% of its debt burden annually in real terms. That is $380 billion per year, transferred from bondholders to the Treasury without a single vote in Congress. Run this for a decade, and you eliminate nearly $4 trillion in real debt. Run it for a generation, and the debt becomes manageable, just as Britain's post-war debt did. Who pays for this? Anyone holding dollars? Your savings account paying 2% while prices rise 5% is losing 3% annually. Your pension fund holding treasury bonds is being slowly expropriated. The purchasing power of your wages erodes faster than your raises compensate. Inflation is the most regressive tax that exists. It falls hardest on those who can least afford it. Those without assets that rise with inflation, those living on fixed incomes, those who trusted that a dollar saved would remain a dollar's worth of value. The wealthy, by contrast, are largely insulated. They own real estate that appreciates with inflation. They hold stocks in companies that can raise prices. They have access to investments, private equity, commodities, foreign assets that maintain value as the currency erodes. Financial repression is in effect. A wealth transfer from the middle class and poor to the government and the acetoning rich. It is the most politically palatable form of default, precisely because most people do not understand it is happening. This is why the Federal Reserve's 2% inflation target is not a ceiling to be avoided, but a floor to be maintained. Deflation falling prices would be catastrophic for a debtor nation. It would increase the real value of debt rather than erode it. The Fed needs inflation. The Treasury needs inflation. The entire fiscal strategy depends on inflation running persistently above the rate paid on government borrowing. The question is not whether America will inflate away its debt. It is already in the process of doing so. The real concern is whether it can manage this inflation slowly enough to prevent a crisis of confidence in the dollar. If the global market comes to believe that holding dollars will result in guaranteed losses due to inflation, people will look for alternatives. This situation represents America's greatest vulnerability, the dollar's last line of defense. Since there is one crucial difference between America's situation and every historical example we have examined. The dollar is not merely America's national currency, it is the world's currency. Its privilege, known as reserve currency status, is simultaneously America's greatest economic asset and its most dangerous vulnerability. Reserve currency status means central banks worldwide hold dollars as their primary savings against economic crises. In international trade, particularly oil and commodities, is priced and settled in dollars. Regardless of whether America is involved, the dollar accounts for approximately 58% of global foreign exchange reserves. It appears on one side of roughly 90% of foreign exchange transactions and finances over 80% of international trade. This creates what French Finance Minister Valéry Giscard d'Estaing called the exorbitant privilege, because the world needs dollars for international business. The United States can create money and effectively export its inflation globally. When the Federal Reserve expands the money supply, those dollars flow into foreign reserves and transactions. And the inflationary pressure is absorbed worldwide rather than concentrated domestically. This is why America has run massive deficits for decades without hyperinflation. The entire world helps carry the burden. America imports far more than it exports. In any normal economy, this would cause the currency to depreciate. But because foreigners need dollars for trade and reserves, demand remains high, regardless of the trade balance. America can consume more than it produces, decade after decade, because the world's appetite for dollars never seems satisfied. It is as if America has discovered a credit card with no limit and no due date. But exorbitant privilege comes with exorbitant vulnerability. The dollar's reserve status depends entirely on global confidence, on foreign governments, believing that holding dollars is safe. The moment the world loses faith in the dollar, the entire system reverses with devastating speed. Instead of exporting inflation, America would suddenly import it. All those trillions of dollars held in foreign reserves would come flooding back home, each one seeking to purchase American goods and assets. Domestic prices would explode. The Federal Reserve would face an impossible choice. It could raise interest rates high enough to defend the currency and attract foreign capital back. But doing so would bankrupt the Treasury, which cannot afford to pay market rates on $38 trillion of debt. Or it could keep rates low and watch the dollar's international value collapse. There is no good option. There is only a choice between different flavors of catastrophe. For decades, this scenario seemed purely theoretical. No currency existed that could plausibly replace the dollar, and came the weaponization. When Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, the United States froze approximately $300 billion of Russian foreign exchange reserves and expelled Russian banks from SWIFT. They demonstrated that dollar holdings can be seized overnight by American political decision. The message to the rest of the world was unmistakable. If you cross America, your dollar reserves can be frozen with the stroke of a pen. China noticed with over $3 trillion in reserves and tense relations over Taiwan. Chinese leaders recognized their reserves were potential hostages. India noticed. Saudi Arabia noticed. Brazil and South Africa noticed. Even traditional American allies began quietly questioning whether complete dependence on dollar-based finance was wise. The response has been gradual but unmistakable. Since 2022, central banks around the world have been purchasing gold at record rates, diversifying away from the dollar into an asset that cannot be frozen. The dollar's share of global reserves, which stood at 72% in 2000, has fallen below 60%. China has sold over $50 billion in U.S. Treasury bonds since early 2024. Russia and China conduct over 90% of bilateral trade in rubles and yuan. India purchases Russian oil in rupees. Brazil and China trade directly in their own currencies. The BRICS bloc has emerged as the primary vehicle for de-dollarization. Originally comprising Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, it now includes Egypt, Ethiopia, Indonesia, Iran, and the United Arab Emirates. With over a dozen additional partner nations, collectively BRICS represents roughly 40% of the world's population and over 30% of global GDP. At their 2024 summit in Kazan, President Putin appeared holding what looked like a prototype of a potential BRICS banknote. The symbolism was powerful and intentional. President Trump has responded by threatening 100% tariffs on any nation that attempts to create a currency challenging the dollar. The threat reveals both American anxiety and American limitations. You cannot tariff your way to reserve currency status. If countries seek alternatives precisely because they fear American economic coercion, threatening more coercion hardly solves the problem. It may accelerate the very trend it seeks to prevent. To be clear, the dollar's displacement is not imminent. No currency can match its liquidity or the network effects built over 80 years. But displacement need not be complete to be catastrophic. If the dollar's share of global reserves falls from 60% to 40% over the next decade, America loses roughly 40% of its ability to export inflation. Those excess dollars return home. Interest rates spike as foreign demand for treasury bonds declines. The debt spiral accelerates dramatically. The truly terrifying aspect of reserve currency transitions is their profoundly nonlinear nature. They do not happen gradually and predictably. They happen slowly, then all at once. Sterling maintained reserve status for decades after Britain's decline began. Then confidence broke in the 1960s and 1970s, and the system shifted with shocking speed. Pound was devalued, the empire dissolved, and London's financial primacy migrated to New York within a single generation. The dollar could follow precisely the same pattern, years of gradual erosion dismissed as manageable, followed by sudden collapse when some trigger causes global confidence to crack. What might that trigger be? A debt ceiling crisis where Congress fails to raise the limit. A geopolitical conflict over Taiwan. A domestic political crisis so severe that foreign investors doubt America's ability to govern itself. Nobody knows which spark will ignite the fire, but the kindling is accumulating. The mathematics are relentless. Interest payments now exceed $1 trillion annually, more than the defense budget, growing faster than any other spending category. $2 trillion more is added to the debt each year. The Federal Reserve is forced to prioritize Treasury solvency over price stability. Meanwhile, foreign nations are buying gold, signing bilateral currency agreements, building alternative payment systems. Every year, the pressure builds. Every year, the margin for error shrinks. The entire strategy relies on threading a needle never successfully threaded at this scale. Inflate fast enough to erode the debt, but slow enough to maintain confidence in the dollar. Keep rates low enough for Treasury to service its obligations, but high enough to prevent capital flight. Convince the world to keep holding dollars even as those dollars are deliberately devalued. Rome could not thread this needle. The denarius became worthless. Weimar could not thread it. Hyperinflation destroyed a nation. Britain threaded it successfully, but the price was surrendering its empire, its reserve currency, and its position as the world's leading power. That managed decline is America's best-case scenario. The question is whether America can achieve even that, or whether some trigger event will cause the gradual erosion to become rapid collapse. America is betting that it is different, that it is exceptional. The rules governing Rome, Weimar, and Britain do not apply. History suggests this is not a bet you want to take. History suggests empires that ignore fiscal reality discover that reality does not care about their exceptionalism. So where does this leave us? The uncomfortable truth is that no good options are remaining, only choices between different degrees of pain. The best case looks like Britain, decades of stagnation, its gradually diminished influence, a standard of living that erodes rather than collapses. The worst case is acceleration. Some trigger event turns gradual erosion into rapid collapse. What can you do with this information? First, understand that the inflation you have experienced is not an accident, it is policy. Second, recognize that assets which cannot be inflated away offer protection that cash savings do not. Third, understand that this will not be solved by the next election. The debt exists. The interest compounds. The mathematics do not care about politics. Nobody knows where America stands on that timeline, but the pattern is clear. The mathematics are unforgiving. The clock keeps ticking.